Yeah.
1, 2, 3.
Is recording?
Yes.
Hello and welcome back to CarWale's Driver Car Series. And our star today is the Maruti Suzuki Fronx. Now I know what you're thinking. Why the Fronx? Isn't Fronx an SUV and isn't this the Driver's Car Series? Well, Maruti would like us to believe that it is an SUV, but we still feel that this is a hatchback. Now when we drove it in the city, when we drove it out on the highways, it felt as compact and agile as a hatchback should. Yes, it is wider and taller and it has a higher ground clearance than the hatchback it's based on, the Baleno. And it also looks beefier than the Baleno. So to find out if our beliefs actually hold true, we're gonna drive the Fronx a little harder than required. We're gonna push it a little further than necessary and see if it's still fun to drive when the Fronx flirts with the limits. It might be based on the Baleno, but Maruti has given the Fronx a completely new top hat. As a result, the Fronx is longer, wider and taller than the Baleno. The two are near identical mechanically as well. The suspension is standard issue for a hatchback with McPherson struts up front and a torsion beam axle at the rear. Ditto for the brakes. The Fronx uses ventilated discs up front and a drum brake setup for the rear wheels. It uses 16-inch wheels like the Baleno, but given its SUV aspirations, the tire profile is a slightly taller 60 compared to 55 on the Baleno. Now before we go berserk with the Fronx, a word about our partner. Now given this series is all about driver involvement and performance, and the petrols that we're going to use in this series are all new age turbo petrols, it's only fair and logical to fuel these cars with the best there is. And enter IndianOil and specifically their high octane fuel XP95. As the name suggests, XP95 is a 95 octane petrol, and as with most things in life revolving around numbers, the higher the better. In this case, XP95 with its higher octane number compared to standard issue petrols, it promises benefits around both performance and efficiency. In our case, with turbo petrols, detonation or engine knock could be a real issue given the more demanding operating conditions within cylinders during combustion. And the most efficient way to avoid detonation is to use higher octane fuel, which of course the XP95 is. Also, XP95 reduces emissions. According to IndianOil, XP95 reduces carbon monoxide emissions by up to 44% and hydrocarbon emissions by up to 13%. As the pop culture adage goes, with great power comes great responsibility, which IndianOil clearly seems to believe. Now XP95 might be a little more expensive than regular fuel, but apart from reduced detonation or knocking thanks to the higher octane number, you also get some additives which reduce the corrosion and clogging of injectors. At least that's what IndianOil says. So in the long run, if you repeatedly use XP95, then apart from performance, you're also looking at reduced wear for your engine component. Is recording?
Yes.
The big difference between the two cars though is in the powertrain. The Fronx uses the smaller 1-litre 3-cylinder engine compared to the Baleno's 1.2-litre, but the Fronx's smaller engine uses turbocharging and direct injection. As a result, it eclipses the Baleno in both power and torque figures, and that should make for a fun to drive experience. Now, like we mentioned earlier, the Fronx might have a small engine in terms of capacity, but thanks to tech like turbocharging and direct injection, it makes handsome output figures. Torque in particular. The max torque at almost 150 Newton meters is handsome in itself, but then thanks to turbocharging, it comes in at 2000 RPM and it peaks at 2000 RPM. And that means when you're driving up a winding road, you never feel like Fronx is short on poke, on torque, on power, so or drive. So you're never really struggling with it. Now I understand that the output figures for this 1 liter turbocharged engine, they aren't outstanding figures, and maybe if you have a really wide road and if you're on a really fast racetrack, it'll feel grossly inadequate. But here, on our regular roads, kart sections, 2-lane roads, it feels more than adequate in my opinion. You're never really, struggling with or wishing that, oh, if I had a little more poke, I would be able to exit that corner faster or make it to the next one a little quicker. No, it just seems to be more than enough when you need it. In fact, the drive is so good that when you are taking the tighter corners, when you're exiting the tighter corners, you have to be very mindful of how much throttle you're giving in, because it just puts so much of that torque down that the tires can't seem to handle it, and then it keeps spinning its wheels, so you have to balance it. So these are just indications that tell you that the engine on the Fronx is more than enough for the job. Plus, if you look at the power to weight ratio, it's 100 bhp a ton, thereabouts. This weighs a little, marginally over, a ton, and power is 100 bhp, so straight off calculation. So yeah, it is a nice engine, it's a peppy engine, and not just the torque, but the character of how it sounds, how it feels, how refined it is. So you can choose to just stick it in second and keep playing between 2000 to 6000 RPM, and it will not complain. Sure, your fuel efficiency might be affected for the worst, but the engine just won't complain, and it doesn't feel strained, it doesn't seem noisy, it doesn't seem wivey. So you can just keep at it and just keep modulating the throttle, a little bit of brakes, and just keep going left, right. So hugely enjoyable in terms of engine, no doubt about that. The Fronx's engine is mated to a 5-speed manual gearbox. No headlining figures or tech here, just a regular old school 5-speed gearbox. But the thing about this gearbox, and as we've seen in most Marutis, is that it's so beautifully positioned that it falls to hand really well. You don't have to reach out, you don't have to hunt for it. It's just the right height, it's just the right distance away from you when you're driving where you're sitting. And the shifts, again, they're not the most precise that we've experienced, but you can roll through the gearbox really quickly. You can just shift as you like, up and down the gearbox, and it'll, it doesn't get in the way, it's not slow, it's not weighing, you know how to slot in, where to slot in, so, you can enjoy yourself in the simple act of shifting gears. And that's what makes a good driving car, in my opinion, especially when it's a manual. So on that front, again, it's a really nice setup. The other thing we like about the gearbox are the ratios. They are really well spaced out, which means you are almost always in the right power band. And like we said, max torque is available from 2000 RPM, and it remains flat throughout. So unless you drop under 1500 RPM, which means you have to be really lazy in terms of driving for you to fall that far, under the power band, to really feel like the engine needs more poke. Otherwise, the ratios are so well spaced that you'll always find yourself in the right RPM band. And that again is what, you're able to utilize that engine's character so well, because you're not struggling with turbo lag, you're not struggling with just waiting on the engine to come in and the performance to kick in for you to be able to drive out of corners. So well-spaced ratios. For you to really enjoy a good gearbox, you have to have a really nice pedal box as well, especially in a manual. And like in most Marutis, you have that. So the spacing is right, the travel between brake and throttle feels right, so you can stay on the brakes and you can then flip the throttle if you want to do heel and towing. And that just adds to the fun factor of driving a manual car. So those things really work out well. And though it's not really a gearbox thing, but the driving position too on this car, the way the seat, pedals, steering, all of that just feels very natural, feels like it should in a car that's good at driving, or that brings out the best of the driver. Now there's one chink in the Fronx's armor when it comes to driving dynamics. It probably has to be the steering. It's being a Maruti, you'd expect that feel from the steering would be very limited, and it is. So you don't expect much on that front. But what we had expected, or what we thought it would have, is a slightly quicker steering. It's not like slow, but it needed to be quicker to be able to, exploit what the car can do. So right now, especially around this twisty section, you have to dial in a whole lot of lock, and that means sometimes you have to, cross over your hands and dial in a little more, and it just requires a lot more work. Like in this case. So it requires a lot more work going around corners, which a quicker steering rack would have helped. So it would have also helped get the car pointed in the direction, quickly or more precisely. Right now there is a fair bit of vagueness that comes in thanks to the steering. It's not something that you can't overcome. It's not something that you can't, live with or adjust to. But yeah, given how good or how nice this engine is, how well the gearbox is set up, and the whole seating, driving position, all of that would have, felt really, or would have come together really well if the steering too would have been in the same ballpark of being driver focused. So that's our only real issue, or the chink that we see, a big chink in the Fronx's armor when it comes to being a driver's car. Now a good engine, a lovely shifted gearbox can only take you so far. At the end, if you really want a car that's fun to drive, that's enjoyable, that's intuitive, well, it has to have good handling. And the Fronx is a mixed bag in that regard. Let me explain. Now the Fronx is a car that's set up on the softer side. And now if you were to, let's say, take it to a racetrack, or if you were to take it to a road that's really well paved and it's, the corners are really well defined, the Fronx would feel inadequate, it might feel lazy, it might feel like it is work. However, on a road like today, where it's got some blind corners, we've got undulations, we've got potholes, we've got gravel, we've got all sorts of stuff. Here, a stiff car would have been super painful because it would be noisy, it would skip around, and I mean, it just would have been a lot more difficult to drive than the Fronx is. Fronx, because it's soft, it's actually quite manageable. and it's comfortable, and it communicates with you quite well. So you can set yourself up to what the car might be doing or might do in response to, let's say, a pothole that it might hit or change in road surface that might come its way. So yeah, the Fronx, the soft setup is a good thing to have on everyday roads. And we say that because when you are driving the car at about 80% or 85% of its ability, it is predictable, it is well balanced. Yes, it rolls around a little, but you can play with it. You can get it to change its line when you want it, otherwise it holds its line. There is enough feedback coming from the front, from the rear, and it is a playful car, so you can chuck it into corners and it does your bidding quite well. However, when you push further, when you go beyond 80-85% of its ability, the road's ability, and when you're trying to find limits, that's when the Fronx feels it can get a little challenging. And that's again a function probably of its setup, because it's not one of those cars that you can just throw into corners and its front will just dive in and hold on. It is lazy in that sense. So you might chuck it, and for a few seconds at the start, yes, the front will bite in and it'll take you in, and then it just becomes loose again and it sets itself to understeer. And honestly, that's not a feeling I enjoy in my cars. I'm sure people who like driving would prefer a car that oversteers rather than understeers and washes away into a corner. So plus, it's more fun to have a car where you have to constantly, dial in counter steer, because that's what driving's about, fun on the limit. So yeah, but on a road like we are doing today, we're cutting some corners, we're taking some jumps, mile jumps, and on all those, the way it lands, the way it settles, and the way it responds feels absolutely right, feels safe, feels reasonably involving, if not right up there. But yeah, it is a fun car to drive on a twisty road. Handling is well judged. I would definitely give it my seal of approval on roads like this. Now, even in terms of braking, it is a well set up, well judged car. So the brake feel, the progression, the travel for the pedal, and the bite, they're all in line with what you'd expect. So there are no real surprises there, especially when you're going up the Ghat road. However, when you are coming down, then it does hold, or it did hold, a very nasty surprise for us. The thing is, we came down the hill with the ESP turned on, and so ESP works, yes, but it does so unobtrusively, I would say. So around really tight corners, hairpin bends, it pulls you into the corner, and that happens because the ESP is working overtime. So when you really need to lean on the brakes, you're coming down and you want to make a sharp turn and you really get hard on the brakes, and suddenly I had no braking. And that's because there was so much brake fade courtesy the ESP working overtime, which I hadn't noticed. So now, as in the case now, what we've been doing since then is we turn the ESP off, and that we've seen brings in a lot more predictability in the way the brakes function. So there have been no surprises as a result. You lean hard, you shift down, you turn in, and there is a good amount of feel and bite now. Plus, you can carry a lot of braking into the corner because of the feel. So instead of it understeering heavy under brakes, because you're carrying so much braking, it can still hold its line, which is, kudos to the brake setup in that sense. But yeah, if you are driving downhill, our suggestion would be turn off the ESP first, or be mindful that something like that might happen. Now, when we started this film, we knew the Fronx is a good fun to drive car. We felt it when we drove it in the city, we felt it when we drove it on the highway, and we wanted to find out if it was still a fun to drive car when you pushed it very close to its limits. Now, we've been driving this car for 2 days, we've been pushing it close to the limit for 2 days, and if you drive it at about 80-85% of its capability, it's a lovely car. It's enjoyable, it's predictable, it's fun, and yeah. But it's only when you really start pushing it, when you start exploring what its limits are, that's when it can get a bit of work, it can get a bit challenging. Again, it's not a car that you would say, I wouldn't touch this again. No, you would still reach out for the keys, only it's not as great. Or it doesn't feel as good as it did at about 80-85%. Steering, yes, that is a big chink, I think, in its armor, because for a car that has such a lovely engine, such a well-set gearbox, and good involving handling, steering plays a big part because that's the thing that you're controlling the most. And there, it's slightly slower than we would have liked. It's not bad again, you can get used to it, but instead of you using just, not having to cross your arms or making those small adjustments in line or throwing it hard into a corner, here you'd have to hold it oddly at places to make that happen, because you just need more turns in the steering for the car to respond the way you want it to. But yeah, the steering apart, I think everything else feels very good on the Fronx, especially on our, unpredictable, I wouldn't say, but flawed roads would be a better term. It feels really good. You're not going to tire out, you're not going to feel like you're going to break something. Even if you misjudge a corner or even if you misjudge a pothole, there is enough for it to roll over it instead of crashing into things. So it's been a fun 2 days for sure with the Fronx. And this is just the start. We will have more driver car videos for you coming soon, so do come back for that, and thank you so much for watching.